Let's turn our attention back now to national security and, the election campaign as well. In that context, joining me now, as he does every Monday, is Professor Simon Jackman. He's from the University of Sydney, of course. And so thanks for being here, as always, Professor
Pleasure.
Jackman. AUKUS, the alliance, how do we see all of those agreements, bipartisan really, in the context of the election? Do they feed into the election in any way, in your view?
Look, I think it's important to realise that while we can expect this election campaign for national security, arguments about national security to figure prominently, expect the alliance to be relatively inoculated from that. There is widespread bipartisan support for the alliance as a general proposition in Australian politics, but in particular with AUKUS currently enjoying is the key deliverable at the heart of the alliance agenda today. Expect two things, I think, Kieran. One is, has the government got any announceables to deliver over the course of the campaign with respect to key elements of the AUKUS agenda bearing fruit? And B, will there be any shades of difference between the coalition and Labor? And I expect not, but I'll be very interested to see how this particular aspect of national security, where there is no substantive difference between the parties, how nonetheless in an election campaign where the coalition is at pains to say that Labor is not a safe pair of hands on some of those big questions facing the nation, how, when it comes to something where demonstrably there is such a strong bipartisan consensus, how does Labor manage that, and how does the coalition perhaps look for perhaps other aspects of the national security agenda to prosecute that argument?
On the substance of the claims that there's bipartisanship, what are the links like between both the parties and Washington, which you know well, that city?
Sure.
Do they both have significant links to Washington, D.C. and to the security establishment there? Yeah,
absolutely. So look, I look at Richard Marles in particular, who is now not Shadow Defence Minister, has a different role, but for leading up to 2019 in particular, when he was Shadow Defence Minister, and Senator Wong, who's been Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister over the 2 terms now. Both of them, DC is a regular to-go place for them. I think going right back to the last time Democrats were in office in Washington, those links got firmed up quite strongly through institutions like the American-Australian Leadership Dialogue, through us, the United States Study Centre, my former home, through the parent organisation of the United States Study Centre, the American-Australia Association. There is a lot of outside of government institutional tissue there for the out party of Australian politics to find, nonetheless, plenty of ways to get to know Washington, get to know their opposite numbers. And it's a key thing that organisations like the US Study Centre, like the AAA, that they perform. There's the government links where the government of the day enjoys that incredibly intimate relationship.
Yeah.
Minister to secretary, secretaries of departments into their opposite numbers in the US. It's a legitimate question to ask. What about opposition? And the answer is, Kieran, there's plenty of opportunities, both, I think, in 1.5 track dialogues, as we call them, and then literally sort of the unofficial dialogues that get stood up by institutions like the ones I was just referring to.
One thing that I've noticed over many years now is that there's often a delay, quite a lengthy delay, in getting the next ambassador in place, particularly when there's a change of administration.
On the American side, yeah.
On the American side, not on our side. We do it overnight. But in terms, because it's so important to us,
That's right.
In terms of the US to Australia, we've got a very high profile, probably the most high profile ambassador in history coming to Canberra in Caroline Kennedy.
I'd share that assessment, yeah. I think that's right.
She's have to be one of the most well-known.
That name doesn't get any bigger.
You don't get any bigger than the Kennedys.
Kennedy,
And she's meant to be coming, but still not here in Canberra. What's the latest on that front?
Well, Kieran, I suspect this will be backed up behind the Australian election. I think parachuting a brand newly minted ambassador into the hothouse of an Australian election campaign. If she does arrive in country before the election, there'll be very limited public engagement, if any at all. And I expect they might even delay the arrival until we get a read on who the next government of Australia is, number one. Number two, I'm surprised, as you are, 2 cycles in a row now, getting someone to Canberra has taken a while. Caroline Kennedy's name was in the mix, Kieran, for a long time. I just think there are a lot of other things to get through the American system. But you're absolutely right. When I said, do you mean the American side or the Australian side? You said, no, on the Australian side, we get there real smart. It does start to reveal an asymmetry between the two countries that is a bit irksome here in Canberra, that we are very quick to get our ambassadors in place and our representation firing very early. If there's a change of government, it is typically a political appointment, but there's never a particularly long hiatus at all. And in some cases, in the case of Kim Beazley, we kept Kim in place even though we transitioned from a Labor government to a coalition government here. I think what's happening we are getting a little bit of a taste, whether we like it or not, that we perhaps do not hit that very, very top tier of must fill in the first 6 months sort of appointments. There are 2 ways to read that, Kieran. One is the Australian-US relationship is in such good shape, it can tolerate not having a political appointee in place for a while. The other is the earlier one I was putting forward, and that is perhaps we don't rate quite as highly as we think we might in DC.
What's the latest in the political equation in the United States? We know that Joe Biden's had a tough time. His approval rating is no more impressive than Donald Trump was during his time in office. So what are the prospects ahead of the midterms of the Democratic Party turning things around, or are they heading for some big losses?
At this point, Kieran, you'd have to say they're heading for big losses, and I think we're looking at the prospect of later this year. There is a version of Australian politics where we have a change of government, but there's also, I think, a much more certain future of American politics where Republicans are in control of the House of Representatives. And if both of those events come to pass, and I think the American one is all but a given, there's only 6 seats for Democrats to play with, and Biden's approval rating is around 40%. That's typically associated with losing about 40 seats, and they've only got 6 to lose. So there is a version of our near futures here where a Labor Australian government is facing, I think, a rather friendly set of faces in a Biden White House, but it's having to do business at the same time with a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, and I think, and if not a Republican Senate.
What are the implications of that, particularly in terms of, I think, of the sort of key defence policy committees in Washington?
There is some very hard yards to do with respect to AUKUS, Kieran. There are many ways in DC that inertia can take hold, both in the bureaucracy, in the armed forces themselves, but also up on Capitol Hill is another key avenue where we need things to go right in order for the AUKUS agenda to be delivered. And how will a Labor set of ministers get on with Republican members of Congress who are chairing some of the key committees? Now, I don't expect any issues there. Those differences have been managed in the past. And indeed, the Friends of Australia caucus in the US Congress is the largest Friends of caucus in the US Congress. And indeed, a subset of it has renamed itself the AUKUS caucus. Nice. Kid you not.
Nice.
And they're trying, I think there's a real bipartisan effort to keep that on track. I think, nonetheless, a new government in Australia with a slightly different, and much more, if it's a Labor government, with much stronger social democratic credentials than a Conservative government in Australia, there'll be some interesting first couple of meetings between, say, Labor ministers and I think Republicans, some of whom are extremely conservative on other issues, how those first set of meetings go down.
Professor Jackman, Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney, thanks as always.
Thanks, Kieran.
See you next
Good
week.
to be with you.